Hello, everybody. Once again, I am Lehman Crafton Jr., aka Zorbalachan Less Than Guru, and today I am doing a review. One of probably three videos that I'll do a review of this system. One will be based off of the setting, one will be based off of the mechanic, and I think this is going to be just kind of my general thoughts and feelings of this game and kind of things that I did to make it my own. Plus, this is a good place for me to give tips and things that I learned on how mass organizations kind of or clubs can work and Mars comes. I'm leaning back because I did a really long hour long 31 day character creation challenge where I made a character for this game and I was hunched over making the character and my back hurts a little because I'm old. So I'm just trying to lean back. So if I tend to pop my back or do something like that, I'm basically just trying to get comfortable and not hurt. So I can't really show you pictures and stuff because this book here, Adventure Quest Jaern, which is what I want to review, doesn't have pictures in this edition. And I can't even remember in the newer ones if they did. I know they came out with the cover in the second printing. This is the first printing in 1991, July. I went to Purdue in 1991 as a setup. I probably will bounce around a lot in this. I have just going full stream of conscious as I do this introductory part of the review. So here's the situation: 1991, no real internet. Computer games are nothing like they are today, nothing like they were 10 years ago, nothing like they were 20 years ago. We're around where EverQuest came out. No, if you wanted to go online and play with other people in a Dungeons and Dragons type game, you went on Muds or Mushes, which were text based, and you typed what you were doing, and then you had shortcut buttons, keyboard strokes that you could do. You really didn't need a mouse. Everything was keyboard. W enter, you go west. N enter, you go north. Pick up sword, wield swords, hit one to swing, things like that. And it wasn't like Google or anything that you would lead you to a site. You'd have to you'd have to find an address, and you would type in telnet and then that number address, and then you were able to connect to other people. Ancient, I know, but that's the setting when I was living through at home, my parents' house, through junior high and high school, playing D&D, reading GI Joe comics, and that's what introduced me to Robotech because they had a big full page ad for Robotech, and I loved Robotech at the time also, and I mailed off the Palladium books. I got my mom to send some money to them. They sent me the book. I loved the book. I was ordering all the books online. I then found a local gaming shop, which was 45 minutes away because I lived out in the middle of nowhere. And there I found the Palladium role-playing game and Palladium systems and got into everything from TMNT, Heroes Unlimited, Robotech, Beyond the Supernatural, Ninjas and Super Spies, and Riffs. And then I went to Gen Con in 91 and learned about all types of games, and then I went off to college. So at college, I'm looking at various clubs, and I'm a role player, and my dorm room did not really have a bunch of role players. Now, when I ever do Hero Quest, I'll tell you how I converted everybody except for one person in my dorm to being a Hero Quest board game player, but that's another story. So I get there and I'm looking to role play, and I find a little flyer talking about the Fantasy Club at Purdue. Fantasy Club, we role play. Wow, that's interesting. And I go there, and they say, this is the game we play. So it wasn't D&D, and it wasn't Palladium, and there was another group over there that were, at the time, they would change their games. And whatever, I can't remember what that group was called, but they were doing Vampire. And I, at that time, did not like the idea of playing Vampire, which will be, if I ever talk about Vampire in the future, but that's just my own personal pet peeves that mean nothing to anybody else, but they're my little prejudices and biases and stuff like that, was against the whole Vampire the Masquerade concept. I'll just say that. So I go to this fantasy club, and I love fantasy, high fantasy. That's my favorite. And they introduced me to this game, Adventure Quest Jaern, and I make a character, and it's this little sheet here, and I roll, and I don't get to adjust stats except for I was a human, so I got 2 placed rolls instead of, if you watch my character creation, I got 1 placed roll. And I had I remember I was very comely, so I was very beautiful, and I had a good strength and maybe a decent health, so I became a barbarian. And that character lasted that whole year and then part of the next year before I died, because this is an old school game where you can die easily, and it also had some game masters, and I talked about it, that went in directions that I personally thought were crap, but I lived with it, and then I became a game master and game mastered the rest of the year, and had pretty good feedback of me being a game master. A lot of people like my game mastering, so I take that as a success. But one of the things that this taught me was how to have large groups of people. Because as a game master and as a player, you would normally have 8 to 10 people, and sometimes it would push it around 14. And it would vary every Saturday night. We would go, and the players would play, and some people would play every Saturday night, like myself, and then others maybe miss some. And you'd have different game masters come up. And the whole concept was this world was mostly water, and there was various small islands around it. About 2% were islands. The rest of it was a shallow freshwater ocean world. And everybody was on this one island, and they'd go to this tavern, and there would be missions, basically. Adventure is needed for this and that and that. And players the game master would come up, and each of them would give a pitch. And when they were done giving their pitch, the people that wanted to go on that adventure would stand up, and the game master, and they would go to another room. They all met at the one room, and then they would go to another room. And then the next game master would come up, and they would give their pitch, and they would take people and go off. And we could break into 3, 4, 5 different groups depending on the night. It all depended on where you wanted to go, or what you wanted to do, or who you wanted to go with. And so a lot of times, me and one of my people who became my friends, we would normally go adventure together, but sometimes we didn't. He might want one thing, and I liked the idea of going somewhere else. But as a game master, that really taught you a lot on how to make adventures to hook people, because otherwise you might only end up with a couple of people that wanted to go with you. And how to control a large group, because we had a limited time. I can't remember exactly when we started, 5, 6, you'd do that, you would go so many hours, and you would break, and people would go out and get food and buy food and bring it back and eat, and then continue, and then around midnight you would stop. So you had to get time management under control and things like that. So there was a lot of things that I learned. Also, it's interesting, there's a OSR kind of a channel out there, Dungeon Craft, who the guy, Professor Dungeon Master, he always does a lot of old school, and things that he talks about that he does in his game reflected a lot of what I saw happening in this game, and that I use based off of this game when I started game mastering. Because pre-Purdue, this, it was mainly me game mastering myself, because I lived in a town of nobody, 198 people total. My brother, when I could at that time pay him a quarter to play, now he actually plays because he likes it. Or there were certain occasions with my Robotech, I was in Boy Scouts, and when we would go on campouts, I would bring my books, and a lot of the other people liked playing then, and sometimes I could get one or two of my friends I could convince them to play. But they weren't into it like I was. And so I didn't have a lot of experience with groups, even a normal group, and a lot of it was in my own head and me doing my own things. And then I went to Purdue and got involved in this, so a lot of things I learned there I brought back. And things were like you do the order around the table. However, those people sat was the order. The group of players, they had one person that rolled the die, and then the next initiative, the next person would roll, and etc. And then they would all go, and then the monsters would all go, or the threats would go, and then they would go, and you just went down until you got to the end. And there was a thing of also like everybody prepare your actions as a game master, and then you would wait a little while. And you let them prepare their actions because you weren't supposed to change what you did. And then you would say, does anyone not have an action prepared? And if somebody raised their hand, you might say, do you have a problem? You're trying to figure something out. And then once they've prepared and nobody peeped up, then you're like, okay, all actions are prepared. Now, Joe, what's Trogar doing, and then Jenny, what is your character? And you just kind of go down. And sometimes as a game master, you had no idea who these people were. They had been in other games when you were a player, went to other places when you were a game master, and they just showed up. So you always made a temple or a table tent, and you would hold that up, and it would have your character name and maybe your name on it. Normally, it just had character name, and since I played I played the same character through the whole thing. People knew me as Fallstove. That was my character. They knew me as Fallstove for over a year before my character died. And then they're like, oh, what's your real name? But you went down the line, and you did that. All the group goes, and then or vice versa, and then all the monsters or enemies go, and you kind of learn that type of mechanic. So there were things that we're really learning. Also being descriptive, and a couple of things I might have mentioned in other videos, but it really means here and with the Aurora to kind of go back to Torg, because Torg is like my main core thing. But Aurora is coming out next week, crowdfunding, so I'll just kind of talk about this because it's a horror thing, but I did it in this game first, so it is relevant. Describing things without over-describing them. Getting people's imaginations to work for you as the game master. You don't need to describe things in bloody, gory detail to invoke fear. And think about it this way. Each person has a different way that their mind thinks, and a different farness that they are willing to go. And if you start trying to push against that, you can upset people. Legitimately upset them because you're pushing it farther than they want to go, and that's not a good thing. But then there's other people that you can come up with whatever the most horrible thing that you can think of and explain it, and they're just like, okay. Because in their mind, they can come up with worse. So one of the things that you can do is coming up with vague descriptions or trying to get them to feel an emotion, and then their own mind paints that picture, and it gets to that point that's horrifying or bad for them, but it doesn't go beyond that. And the example that I love to give is I had a monster that radiated fear, and there's a fear ability in this book that you can give to a monster. And I wanted to describe this fear and actually kind of make the players hesitant about what their characters should do. And we had it was a college, but we had people that were parents because maybe they were grad students, and then they had kids or younger siblings, and I don't know what one of them was, and I probably mentioned this in another thing, but again, it fits this game, it fits this story, so if you heard it from me, you can skip ahead or listen to the story again. I just love this story because it's one of the 30 years later, it's one of my best, what I consider one of my best moments as a game master. And there was a young girl, probably 12 to 14 years old, young teen, tween teen age, definitely not college at all. And she came to my group. She liked my pitch, and I had a bunch of people. And so I'm trying in my mind to figure out how I can say things without damaging a child too bad. Because I am at this time, what, like 19 years old, okay? And back then, you didn't have the internet and TVs and stuff telling you how to do things and how to be sensitive. I came from a rural backwoods area of 198 people living very similar to how they did 100 years ago and stuff. So not to like push blame off myself, but I was trying to be very aware of things. And this monster had fear, and I wanted to do this, but I didn't want to get into bloody, gory details of what crazy things it was trying to present to each of the characters' minds. So I didn't want to say, "Oh, you have visions of jaws being ripped out," things like that. So this scenario happens, and this girl is like, what's my character feeling? And I come up with the idea to tell her, remember when you were little and it was nighttime and you woke up after a bad dream and you still felt that thing was in the room and you wanted to call out to your mom and your mouth open but the words could not come out. And she's like looking at me and her eyes get all wide and she's like, yeah. And I said, that's what your character feels like. That's as far as I went. Everybody in the room understood that. No matter what age you are, you can probably go back to that moment and get that feeling of fear and maybe even get some goosebumps or something going. And then we continued, and I continued the campaign or the session, and it ended and stuff. And later, she came up to me, and whoever her guardians were, like I said, it was probably one or two times that I actually interacted with this young girl, and they basically told me how great of a job that I did, and I like really took that to heart. Like I really was happy that I was able to get everybody in the group feeling the same way but differently because I let their own mind come up with the thing, the fear, the thing that their character feared, the thing that they feared. And it's just something I want to give to you as a tip. You don't have to go visceral. You don't have to go into maddeningly minutia and describe everything. Sometimes just a generality of a remember that one time, and almost everybody has had that one time, and go general and let them come up with the specifics on their own. And that was just something that worked. So that was one of the things that then when I came back from Purdue the first year, I was there 2 years, but I came back the first year, and I actually got my friends because a lot of friends, like say they went into the Army, well, they were gone for 4 years, they weren't coming back, or the Navy, or whatever armed forces branch they went into, or other ones went and they just moved completely, so they didn't come back. But the people that came back and the people that then after that point became my friends, and a lot of them are still with me in my group now. This was the game that they were introduced to role playing. It wasn't through Dungeons and Dragons. It wasn't through Palladium, which would have been if I wouldn't have had this book. But it was actually through this game, Adventure Quest Jaern. This is a math-heavy game. It is one that you have to almost use a calculator to figure out stuff, especially when you're buying multiple things. When I get into the mechanics, I'll talk about that. But it's a game that once you get through those mechanics, the play is very simple. It's very old school D&D like. You roll a d20, you might have a modifier to it. Um, your skills are you're rolling a certain number of dice under the skills. Even it might be what the game master tells you, like, oh, that's a normal difficulty. Roll 2d6. If you roll under your skill, equal to your skill or under, you succeed. If not, you fail. If it's more difficult, add a die. Roll 3d6. If it's very easy, subtract a die. It's a d6. And then the baseline of 2d6 becomes a 3d6 when you're rolling directly against an attribute. Because attributes usually, instead of starting at 0 and you buying them up ranks, your attributes starts higher, 3 to 16 normally. So you would add an extra die. So the normal would be 3d6, a hard would be 4, an easy would be 2. And it had that type of thing. There was also ways that the character or the player could determine whether the character did something. They could try to press, they could have a 6, and well, they're going to guarantee a 1d6. So if they wanted to do like an extra attack, they could roll, and they're always going to get that. But if they pressed it with 2d6 and they failed, they would not get any attack. They tried and they failed. But they might roll 2d6 under at a 6 or lower, and then they would get 3 attacks. One attack normal, and then an extra attack for each die they rolled after it. So it gave that risk and reward, and it put that type of thing on the character. So there was that whole type of thing going on. Now they had a spell rest per day. You got spell units, and you would use them, and then you would rest, and then you would gain them back. And then there were a couple of priests that actually one of their groups was how they gained those spells back. When I took this home, after a year of playing this, and we actually got through a campaign, and a whole campaign. We got through a campaign and ended it, and we played some other games like Palladium and went off. And when I came back to this, then that's when I made it my own. I had taken my own setting before, but then I added some mechanics. And mechanics that I added were ways for wizards and priests to basically energize themselves with magic. So instead of starting with magic and using these spell units, basically magic points, and then resting and gaining them back, they would start with 0 just through. You couldn't hold the magic in you, otherwise it would start burning you up actually and doing damage to you. So what I had was you would start with 0 under normal circumstances, and then when you wanted to cast a spell, you would energize, and that would take you around. But then you had an energized skill that you would roll dice, and that would be how much energy you got. And then you could cast spells, and then once you got low, you could energize yourself again, and you could keep doing that. So basically there was a trade-off. You didn't rest and get refreshed, but throughout the day you can continue, but you're always going to, every once in a while, you're going to need to stop and not do something so that you can energize. And then, like I said, once that energy was in you, if it stayed in you too long, it would start doing damage points. For every spell point you had, it would do a point of, they had damage points instead of hit points, but they're basically exactly the same thing. It would do damage to you. So then I had a system to get rid of that. I think I called it flush even, flush it out. So you would energize and then you would flush, and then I had ways of seeing magic and stuff. So I added some rules, and my players really liked those rules. And then when I made my own game, a lot of it was based off of this system. So basically, I just want to say, when I get into the world setting and when I get into the mechanics, this is an old school game. This is a game that to make and adjust and advance a character, it does take time, and there is math. When you play the game, though, when you actually get into the adventure, it's very easy, flows very well. The rules are pretty good. The game master can make rulings on the fly, just figuring out how many dice do I want this person to roll under, what do I think, is it this, or this, and things are kind of clear cut. One of the other things is there's a certain number of spell ranks that you can get, and mages can get 16 and priests can get 12. But if a mage would cast anything above a 12, they would lose the spell, the highest level spell that they have, or ranked spell that they have. I changed it so that they could only do it so many times, and they had to wait so long to bring it back, because I didn't want experience wasted on buying the same spell over and over. As a group, a big group of, say 40 people under various game masters, that's how it controlled the power of magic users, because they would lose things and they'd have to do adventures to get them back. And me, with my group, it wasn't necessarily I needed to balance my whole group against 40 other people. I just balanced it against my home group, so I did different. So this is a game that I really made my own, and I really love it. I've had a couple of sessions since then, and every time I look at it, it's just like I want to get in it, but I wish I had time, and I just don't have time. And when I gave my players the vote, this doesn't have a character sheet on Roll20, so I'd have to do everything free form, or I'd have to make up a character sheet, sadly. So Palladium ended up being that, but this probably would have ended up, if if I hadn't offered Palladium. So this is a game you can go to Adventure Quest Jaern and download the PDF and check it out yourself. It's free. And if you like that idea of it being a little math heavy, and you can make your own magic items in here in a real way, all magic items were based off spells. So you put, if you're a mage, it has rules on how you put your spell into items, or if you're a cleric priest, how you take those spells and put them into items. And it came up, everything was experience points based, so it wasn't level based. It wasn't like everything went up a level. It was everything is you divvy out experience points to raise things. And the other thing that I really liked about this game was the different levels of difficulty for a skill determine how much your base cost was. So we're a lot of games out there that have point buy systems. To go from a 0 to a 1 is 1, and to go from a 1 to a 2 is 2 points, and to go from a 2 to a 3 is 3 points. This game did it different. They did what they had what's called a base cost. The base cost meant if you had a base cost of 300, to go from a 0 to a 1 would be 300. To go to a 1 to a 2 would be 600, 2 times it. To go to a 3 would be 900. Now, if you had something that had a base cost of 100, a different skill, then it was 100, 200, 300. And basically, they figured out these things should be easier to learn, so they take less experience points. These things should be harder to learn, so they take more experience points. And a lot, like with weapons, a dagger was much lower than a two-handed sword. And that's kind of how they had the difference between, stabbing 5 times with a 1d4 dagger or hitting somebody with a 1d12 sword, is adjusting it. So there were ways that kind of helped that flow, and I think it really worked well. You do have to get into the math. If you don't like math, probably not a system for you, but take a look at their character or their monster creation rules and things like that, because a lot of that could be applied. This here has no adventure. I took D&D games, and that's what really solidified when I brought it back. When I was at Purdue, I was making my own stuff up. But then during summer breaks, when we would play this, a lot of times I would grab D&D adventures and just play the D&D adventures. And because it's a D20 to hit, and you have a plus to hit based off of something, and fireballs and stuff at a certain level do, like 46 to 66, and hit points are relatively similar. They were, you got more of them different. You had to use experience points to buy your damage points here, but an experienced person here had about what a experienced person here say has 50 to 70 hit points, and that was equivalent to something in D&D, and it was very easy to bring together. Take from any place either ideas or just bring the monsters, and half the time you don't have to convert it. When a dagger does a D4, when a big sword, normally like a normal two-handed sword, does a D10. They had one that was a little bit bigger that did a D12, but relatively the same amount. When you have armor that you're wearing plate mail and you're a good warrior type, and it's like 18 to 20 to hit you, and for somebody who's wearing leather, it's like a 12. Hello, all the numbers are the same. It doesn't matter if it's called armor class or a CDV, combat defense value, or if it's hit points versus damage points, or if it's a level-based system versus a point base cost point experience buying system. All the dice rolls are similar enough to just convert. So I'm getting around. I guess it looks like 30 minutes, so I'll go ahead and I'll call that here. Thank you for watching. I do want to do one again for the mechanics and one for the setting, but I wanted to, after I made that character, again, it was bringing up a lot of memories, kind of like when I did the L5R yesterday, that it brought up those memories. But this game here, Adventure Quest Jaern, you can look at it online, download the current PDF. It will be different than this, but the basic premise is about the same. It's just something old school that's not D&D. It's another one of those old school not D&D, and I think the in-game aspect of it is simpler than Palladium. So if you're interested in my Palladium, but it seemed a little too complicated, especially when I was saying this rule doesn't make sense, and this rule doesn't make sense, and this rule doesn't make sense, these you might not agree with. There might be things that you're like, why did they do it that way? But it makes sense. This was designed by a computer programmer, however, that software programmer. The guy, Daniel Lawrence, was the guy who wrote Telengard, a old school D&D like adventure game on like the Commodore 64, those type of ancient computers and entertainment system type things. This was written by somebody with that went to an engineering school, so it makes sense. You might not agree with it, but it makes sense when you get down to it. There wasn't many rules that I changed. The rules I changed was just because I went from a huge university club, the fantasy club, of many people, and broke it down to my core group of usually around 6 to 10 people, depending on the time that I was doing it. That all the characters went on one adventure, and it wasn't breaking it up. So very good core rules if you don't do it. If you don't mind doing the math to begin with, and for advancement. If you're okay with spending time thinking about stuff and knowing how you're going to advance or where you're going to put points, and you can get that concept down, and then when you play the game, you don't have to worry about that. You just play the game. Very good system that I recommend. So Adventure Quest Jaern, if you like, you can hit like. If you dislike, you can dislike. If you thought that I could ramble too much, hit the dislike. Tell me I'm rambling too much. You don't want to hear this crap. But if you like it, you have questions on it, especially since I'm doing a lot of old school type things. If you want to hear more of my ideas about old school experience I've actually lived through, ask me. So subscribe if you want to subscribe. I appreciate my subscribers. I appreciate my viewers. Everybody, this just gives me an outlet instead of getting on forums and getting into flame wars and or even trying to explain my side of things. I can just present things and you can see me as a person instead of a hidden figure typing on the keyboard mad. So I am Lehman Crafton, aka Zorval Chan, less than guru, and until next time.